and welcome to the channel. This is Nerd.World, and I'm back on the Stargate franchise. This episode, if you didn't know from clicking on the link, is about the overall fleet plan of the Goa'uld from the Stargate franchise. Everything from the Death Glider right the way up to the Tel'tak, its function and its place within the Goa'uld Navy. Before we get started, if you like this video or any others on the channel, and there are full playlists including a full Stargate playlist as well as Star Trek and other sci-fi franchises, all on the channel, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and if you really like it, hit the bell notification icon. With that said, let's get started, and we're going to begin with the wee one, the Death Glider. Now, to begin with, the Death Glider has a few variants. There is a sort of atmospheric primary use one, which hasn't got a fully enclosed cockpit. There is the standard stock Death Glider with two enlarged staff cannons, which are removable to be used as man-portable or entrenched positions with fold-down wings, as well as a so-called needle threader, which, by the way, I have a full video on, which hopefully I will link, but I'll probably forget, but it's in the Stargate playlist. The actual Death Glider as well makes my list of worst space superiority fighters ever, which I have a countdown of the 6 worst fighters you'd ever want to be in, and this is one of them. The Death Glider is very maneuverable, very fast, not very well armed, not very cleverly armed anyway, unshielded, no hyperdrive, not enough life support, not enough range, and poorly defended. It is not a space superiority fighter, it is a weapon of terror, but it is the stock form standard infantry ground attack support craft used by the Goa'uld, both in space and in atmosphere. One of its advantages is they can build these things quickly, they're easily piloted, they're pretty easy to learn, and the Goa'uld don't really care how many of them they lose. They're basically the TIE fighter of the Stargate franchise. Now, other than that, it's a perfectly good fighter. You're just quite likely to die in one. Now, as I said, they are very maneuverable, they are very fast, and as long as you know how to use them, you might be able to not get hit, but you probably won't be able to hit your target. The weapons are not very long range, they're pretty much monodirectional with very little pivot, if any at all. As I said, this is a weapon of terror designed to attack large formations. So with that said, let's move on to the next ship in the Goa'uld Empire. This is another extraordinarily common vessel used by the Goa'uld. This vessel served a multitude of purposes, some of them military, some of them not, sometimes equipped with a cloaking device, sometimes not. This vessel had occasionally weapons, usually not. It had a hyperdrive, it had shields, it had ring transporters built into it. It was the Tel'tak, the Goa'uld cargo ship, but this vessel, as I said, served a multitude of functions. It was cargo vessel, transport, scout ship, reconnaissance craft, which is basically the same thing, observation craft, you name it. This thing could do it. It was used by some non-Goa'uld assets as well, not just ones that fell into the hands of other powers such as the Tauri, but they were occasionally sort of given out to other people such as bounty hunters who would use them. These were extremely versatile, used by every faction of the Goa'uld, not just the System Lords but the Tok'ra and others. They were not exactly powerful. They weren't that quick, but then again, it's fast enough. It's capable of FTL after all. They were poorly armoured and, as I said, usually unarmed, although they could be equipped with weapons on occasion. Their biggest feature was their anonymity. There were so many of them. The Goa'uld probably built millions of these things. Their primary function was that of cargo vessel, but because of the variants of them, such as the Scouts or Reconnaissance version, you didn't always know what you were doing. They looked superficially the same, but some of them were equipped with a cloaking device that allowed them to hide, and they'd simply sit there and they'd watch you. They could sustain a crew for a long time just monitoring, reporting. A very efficient and unusually good design for the Goa'uld. Getting into the larger vessels slightly, we've got the Goa'uld Alkesh, or mid-range bomber. This was a multi-role spacecraft, which was of a typical Goa'uld design. We start to see more similar to the Tel'tak of their pyramidic form beginning to take shape. This vessel has very distinctive, visible sublight engines, probably due to the vessel's, although actually containing a hyperdrive, it was predominantly designed for maneuvering using its sublight, so it had an enormous amount of power to its sublight engines to give it acceleration and speed, not to mention maneuverability. The vessel was not overly heavily armed, but what it did have was capital ship grade energy cannons capable of both planetary attack as well as starship attack. The vessel again could be equipped with a cloaking device, had shields, ring transporters, and was generally a tough little bastard of a ship. Although not really a match for a Goa'uld Hatak, its speed and maneuvering meant that the Hatak actually had difficulty dealing with it because it was so fast and maneuverable it couldn't really hit it and would often either have to deploy other Alkesh or gliders to intercept it, although a sustained battle with a Hatak probably would not be a good idea for the Alkesh. It could probably outmaneuver it for a while, but eventually the sheer volume of firepower was going to take this thing out, not to mention other alien vessels that would engage it, such as the Asgard. It simply would be swatted like a fly. But it served the role within the Goa'uld Navy that was very vital, of a sort of rapid response ground assault craft which had a bit more kick than a glider when a Hatak was not required. The Hatak class mothership was probably the most versatile ship the Goa'uld had, although in many ways this vessel was built for intimidation as much as it was for war. It was a very capable vessel. It had the ability to deploy thousands of Jafar soldiers, several wings of gliders, and was a monumentally heavily armed ship capable of engaging both small and large enemy craft. It was equipped with an extremely advanced hyperdrive. Now there were variants of this ship depending on which system lord had commissioned their construction, but generally speaking the standard Hatak class vessel was built around a three-sided pyramid with a superstructure around it which contained most of the weapons. Again, this was a fast ship which was very elaborately and ornately internally devised. This was because the Goa'uld were all about showmanship as much as they were about anything else. These vessels were built to impress and intimidate both humans and Jafar. The Jafar soldiers aboard them had to be constantly reminded of the greatness of their god, and therefore the walls of the ship would be constantly plastered with reliefs and glyphs of their abilities, but this would also conceal many control panels as well as weapon systems and other technology hidden within the ship. So superficially the interior might almost seem primitive, but it was actually disguised very advanced technology. In addition to this, these vessels again could carry Alkesh, Tel'taks, as well as other ground troop deploying vessels. Overall, an extremely versatile and powerful ship, and was used by every major Goa'uld for thousands of years. Now, Ra's mothership was clearly a variant of the Hatak series. Based on the size of the pyramid on Abydos, this vessel was smaller than a standard Hatak, but was about the same size as the Great Pyramid at Giza, as the one on Abydos was estimated to be roughly the same size. The vessel was much more of a floating palace than it was a true warship. Although it was armed and defended and hyperspace capable, it was not as well equipped for battle as a standard Hatak, which does beg the question why Ra was floating around in it without any escorts. It was clearly a capable starship, but was based on the interior, the lavish decoration, the elaborate way the vessel was able to open up when it landed. It was clearly a vessel more built to show off than fight, but was a beautiful ship, and it was Ra's choice. He was a supreme Goa'uld. He wants to have a pleasure palace ship, he can, and he did, and then he got blown up with a nuke. Now, many of the Goa'uld system mods did have their own personal sort of capital ship, their own flagship as it were. Now it's not clear whether this vessel was actually built by Sokar or whether it was actually commissioned by Apophis himself. Based on the belligerence of the design, it was probably a ship built by Sokar that Apophis, when he took over Sokar's forces, made his own. The vessel, in its time when it was built, was the most powerful ship in the Goa'uld navy. Enormous, 3-4 times the size of a standard Hatak, and probably 5 times as powerful. This vessel, unlike a standard Hatak, was still a little showy, but was actually much more belligerently built and was more built for open warfare, and as a result was a much more fearsome adversary for vessels coming up against it, both Goa'uld and alien, making it pretty much the most powerful ship in the galaxy at time of commissioning, as well as the fastest. The vessel would later be destroyed by the replicators, but an extragalactic threat of that level, I don't think there was anything in the Milky Way that could stand toe to toe with them at the time. I mean, the Asgard were getting their asses handed to them by them. But the ship was very impressive and had an interesting sort of feature of sort of adjustable pivots on those sort of huge protruding spines around the ship, which I don't really know what that was for, but seemed to have something to do with the vessel entering hyperspace. But an impressive ship, and unlike Ra's flagship, less show, more efficiency, but that could have been a reflection of the times. After all, with Ra's death, the Goa'uld Empire had become incredibly unstable and much more violent and prone to infighting. You probably weren't in a position where you could laze around the galaxy in a pleasure ship. Now you had to have big guns protecting you at all times. Basically, with Ra's death, it was the beginning of the end of the Goa'uld Empire, as the System Lords began to tear themselves apart without Ra there to stop them. Now, Anubis' flagship was... If Apophis' flagship was a couple of steps ahead of the rest of the fleet, this thing had run a marathon ahead of the rest of the Goa'uld Navy. Not only was this vessel souped up with all kind of ancient technology that Anubis had gleaned during his time during Ascension, but also it was phenomenally huge, as big as the city of Atlantis. So this thing was a floating city in space. This was not in any way, shape or form a palace. You note that the ornamentation inside the ship, although still quite ostentatious, is nowhere near to the same sort of level that it is aboard other Goa'uld ships. This vessel was as much research vessel, warship, command ship, and dreadnought as it was anything else. It could take on entire navies of Hataks. It could take on the Asgard without a problem. Even a standard one of Anubis's Motherships could take on an Asgard Ballistner class warship head to head and at least stand a chance of survival. This vessel could actually take on a small fleet of Asgard warships without it being a problem. He built at least 2 of them, and they were the fastest, most heavily armed and most powerful vessel ever built by any of the Goa'uld System Lords. Although ultimately they were both destroyed, one by the collective forces of the Goa'uld and the other by a Alterran defense system at Earth while Anubis attempted to attack it. These vessels nonetheless were a true powerhouse. Now, I do have a full breakdown of this ship, a dedicated video, which again I'll try and remember to link, but I won't, but it is in the Stargate playlist, which hopefully I'll link, so all of them will just be in there. Now, of course, any one of these vessels is an impressive piece of technological engineering in and of itself, albeit often quite showy rather than efficient, but they still work. One of the Goa'uld's strengths was their vast resources and their ability to deploy huge numbers of soldiers, ships, and equipment to any given theatre of war in the galaxy at any given time, with seemingly no great loss to their overall power base. These ships were designed to be complementary. The Hatak was the main gun battery, the gliders were space superiority fighter and ground attack, the Alkesh served as a mid-range bomber, ground attack vehicle, as well as an augmentation to the firepower of the Hataks when attacking other alien ships or even other Goa'uld vessels. There is, of course, some variations. There are a few other specialist crafts, such as a flagship built by Anubis Apophis that never was completed, but there were also numerous other variants of gliders and other such ships, mostly specialized one-offs or older ships that are no longer produced anymore. But as a core, this was the main part of the Goa'uld Navy, and it was designed, as I said, to be complementary, with wings of different ships working in sequence with one another to outflank and outmaneuver. Where one ship's deficiency was going to make it lose the battle, there was another ship picking it up. The Hattaks had the big guns, the Alkesh had the sort of medium-sized guns, and the gliders could take care of fighters, which was something the bigger Hattaks had difficulty doing, although Alkesh were quite capable of dealing with other fighters. This wasn't to say, as I said, that Hattaks were incapable of dealing with fighter craft. They were, but generally speaking, they'd have to use sort of overkill, fire lots of big guns in the general direction of the fighter and kind of hope they hit it, which eventually they would, but it again was a nuisance which realistically the gliders could take care of. The other larger capital ships were usually specialized. Apophis' ship was one of a kind. Anubis only had 2 of his flagships that we know of, and he didn't have them at the same time, although he was probably building the second one when the first one was destroyed. And there we have the broad Goa'uld Navy and their basic doctrine. Goa'uld naval doctrine is not unlike that of another sci-fi franchise, and I'm sure you can easily make comparisons to the Tarkin doctrine of being big and scary and not overly necessarily effective. This probably wasn't the case thousands of years ago when the Goa'uld Empire was expanding in all directions, but has grown fat and complacent with age. A bloated, gluttonous empire which is rich on its own success with no real enemies left to fight, which was one of the reasons why a technically inferior power like the Tauri was able to threaten them at all. Their arrogance, short-sightedness, and their overconfidence in their technology, and their basically disapproval of humans as seeing all humans as primitive, because to them Bronze Age humans or the Tauri Industrial Age humans are so primitive by comparison that they were almost seen as the same level and not really a major threat. But they were mistaken about that, weren't they? Now, with all that said, I'm going to bring this video to a close. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. Tell me what your favourite Goa'uld vessel is, if you want to see a breakdown on one of these ships more thoroughly, other than a brief overview like in this video. As I said, I've already done Apophis' flagship, Anubis' flagship, but I haven't done a specific breakdown of any of the other vessels. If you'd like to see it, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll add it to my list for a future video. With that said, thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video if you did, and bye bye.